Hi everyone, this is Becca with Faith Exposed. Thank you for joining me. Imagine with me that a car company releases its instruction manual that's said to have been written by the very original engineer of the car. You'd open it expecting accurate information, where the oil goes, what type of gas to use, and how to maintain the engine. Now imagine that instead it tells you to feed it orange juice and slap the tires to make it go. You would know immediately that whoever wrote this instruction manual is not the same person that designed the car to begin with. If it's true that a God created us and also inspired a book in order to reveal himself to us, then we should expect that book to display an unmistakable, fundamental understanding of how we work, from our psychology to our physical bodies. After all, almost anyone can write a book and say, God told me to. That's easy. And many holy texts do exactly that, including the Bible. If we want to evaluate whether a certain holy book is actually inspired by a God, then we can't just take its claims at face value because they're all making similar claims. And we shouldn't just succumb to manipulation and believe whichever gives us the best promise for reward or the worst punishment. One helpful clue would be to observe how well this book genuinely comprehends our human nature. And yet the Bible often stumbles into these ideas that aren't just outdated, but they're fundamentally alien to how people think, feel, and live. Now, let's walk through some of the more revealing moments in the Bible, those that make us ask, does this God even know how humans work? The first revealing moment comes to us straight from the book of Job, and that's when God utterly destroys poor Job's life. His livestock gets killed and his health is shattered, and his dear children are killed in a freak accident. But don't worry, God eventually restores Job. That restoration includes getting his health back, gaining more wealth, and a brand new set of children. Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And next we hear about God's idea of restoring Job after all of the harm he put him through. So the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep and 6,000 camels, and 1,000 yoke of oxen and 1,000 she-asses. He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters. So we were told that Job started out with 7 sons and 3 daughters, and now after all of the calamity, God's restoration includes a new set of replacement children, exactly 7 sons and 3 daughters. Then we're told a little bit about his new kids. He called the name of the first Jemima, and the name of the second Kezia, and the name of the third Karen-happuch, or something like that. And in all the land there were no women found so fair as the daughters of Job. So apparently the new daughters were prettier than the originals, so that makes them better, because God sees their looks as a measure of their value and worth. The main lesson in this story is that the God of the Bible sees nothing wrong with killing Job's original children and then replacing them with what he views as an upgrade. But this reflects such a profound misunderstanding of human love and grief and the relationship that parents have with their children. If a parent loses a child, they don't simply replace them and then go back to normal. Each of their children is unique and irreplaceable. Our morals have evolved so far past what's displayed in the Bible that it's even comical to look back and see what these writers were thinking and the different behaviors that they projected into their image of a perfect God. This is not some portrait of divine wisdom that we see in the Bible. It's a glaring disconnect from basic human empathy. And Job's original children were merely collateral damage in this bet between Yahweh and Satan. The second revealing moment in the Bible is when Jesus asks his followers to leave their families and follow him. Throughout the Bible, there's this recurring theme of a God who demands loyalty to himself at the expense of family. From the Old Testament all the way through to the words of Jesus himself. Being devoted to God is not something that includes and honors your family ties, but it's something that requires breaking them. Let's start with one of the most disturbing examples, the story of Abraham and Isaac. Genesis 22:2 says, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering." God's not just asking for Abraham's love and loyalty, he asks for his son's life. Not metaphorically, he literally says to Abraham to kill his child as a human sacrifice. Abraham is required to completely sever the bond he has with his son in order to prove devotion to this Jesus Yahweh. Little Isaac was to be slaughtered and burned painfully as a test. Being willing to betray and cause such harm to your own child was considered a moral good according to the Bible. But this isn't divine wisdom, it's emotional manipulation, making sure adherents have no other ties. And the theme does not stop there. Jesus takes it even further. Luke 14:26 says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, he cannot be my disciple." Yes, hate. That's the word he uses. Whether you interpret this metaphorically or literally, the message is still clear. Your love for me must override that of your love for your family. I can't stress enough how a real, all-loving God would never make these two things mutually exclusive if he understood how humans work. Now, Britt Hartley from her channel No Nonsense Spirituality has put this concept very well.
If enlightenment is making it harder to sit with your family rather than easier, what good is it for? If you have to leave the world and go on to meditate on mountains to get enlightened, that's an escape. That's a vacation. States of consciousness and states of transcendence where you feel love to all humans. When you're by yourself, that is very easy. When you're in traffic with kids screaming, that's the real test. So many men I meet, especially in the guru space, think that enlightenment means transcending your body, transcending reality, transcending humanity, transcending your family. And what I've learned from the whisper of mystic voices of women is that's an easy path and a self-serving one and an escape. Almost like a new drug where you get to feel like you are operating at a higher level than other people and you're escaping reality. If it doesn't help you get deeper into your life, deeper into your body, deeper into humanity, if enlightenment means you have to leave it all and leave your body in order to achieve something, it's just a new escape.
Jesus sounds less like a divine teacher and more like a cult leader, someone telling people to abandon their responsibilities and identities in favor of blind allegiance to him. This mindset has real-world consequences. I've seen it, and you may have too. Families funneling their time, energy, and money into religious institutions, even while their own households and children struggle. And it doesn't stop there. Non-believing or LGBTQ+ children are sometimes shunned and disowned, all in the name of this spiritual loyalty. But I'm sorry, any type of spirituality that involves not accepting your own children has deep flaws. Sure, it's not as violent as the Old Testament laws calling for stoning disobedient children, but the damage is still real. It's emotional abandonment. This is teaching a very conditional love, and it's teaching you to prioritize God over your own kids, as if loving your children were something selfish to do. And this God concept that you're prioritizing over your own kids is really just this church. It's just this religion. So really, you're prioritizing these men who claim to speak for God over your love for your own children. A real God would not use your children as an object for testing. He would never risk their own well-being in order for you to prove your faith. Otherwise, religion easily becomes a way to dodge having to do the hard work of showing up for your family. And our next revealing moment in the Bible is when this God reveals to us how entirely oblivious he is to the effects of PTSD on his people. The Bible describes horrific acts of mass violence commanded by God, total extermination of people groups, including women, children, and babies, even their animals. This God gives no allowance for the grief of his people, but he gets right back into giving them brutal commands and judging them. Now, go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. That is the God of the Bible speaking to Saul, ordering the annihilation of an entire population, including babies. And that's on top of his many commands to stone people to death for their infractions, including one's own children. And if stoning your own child to death for their disobedience doesn't give a person PTSD, then I don't know what will. The Bible does not sugarcoat the order, but what is strangely absent is any recognition of the emotional consequences of these actions. His commands show a complete disregard for the harm of trauma on these people's minds and well-being. He should understand how physically ending the life of a small child, even under divine command, would completely shatter a person's well-being and also mold their future tendencies and behaviors. Someone who created and designed the blueprint of the human mind would show a much better understanding of these things. He should understand how human empathy, even when it's for members of a different tribe that worship a different god, is not a flaw, but rather it's an essential part of the human moral compass. But instead, we see the same level of understanding as the men of the time. And if this God wanted people dead, then he could have handled it himself. He is the all-powerful God of the universe. He could have sent an earthquake or a flood, a windstorm, or just have not created them in the first place. But instead, he has men carry out this violence personally. And when they aren't able to carry out this cruelty, like when Saul leaves a few survivors, this God gets angry because it's all about stone-cold obedience for him, not empathy, not morality. Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Here we see that mercy is punished and obedience to slaughter is praised. A study in the Journal of Traumatic Stress introduces the concept of moral injury, the internal suffering that results when people violate their own deeply held moral beliefs, such as killing innocents. Veterans who participated in or witnessed atrocities, especially those involving civilians, have some of the highest rates of long-term PTSD, flashbacks, dissociation, emotional numbness, suicidal ideation. A U.S. Army study found that 13 to 31% of soldiers deployed in combat zones show symptoms of PTSD, and those numbers increase dramatically when exposure includes civilian casualties or close-up killing. And this was exactly the case for all of the killings that Yahweh commanded. So how is it that ancient Israelite soldiers, supposedly commanded by God to massacre babies and entire towns, show no signs of emotional collapse? No haunted memories, no trauma. Their God only seems interested in more judging, testing, and getting more worship out of them. When your belief system posits an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God who created us, then there really is no excuse for miscommunication. Such a being would be in charge of creating our minds, and he would have all knowledge of what it would take to effectively communicate a message to us. So if this belief system checks out, then we should never see instances where well-meaning people misinterpret God's message to us. This God is all-powerful, so he can use any method of communicating, and he's all-knowing, so he understands our minds and knows exactly what he would need to say and how to say it in order to effectively communicate to us. But his main way of communicating to us is through this book, the Bible, which is very complex, and it takes people studying for years and decades just to try to understand what it's saying. We have people dedicating their lives to learning this Greek and Hebrew languages and studying hermeneutics and typology and all other methods, trying to understand what God's message really is. But we know that whoever created us created a significant percentage of us unable to read and not having the intellectual ability to learn multiple languages or to decipher which passages are metaphors and which are literal. A true God would not be so ableist and excluding people with lower abilities from understanding what he's trying to say. It doesn't make sense that about half of the population is not capable of reading the Bible themselves effectively, but they're completely at the mercy of somebody else, a third party, to interpret it for them. I think this alone casts a huge amount of doubt on whether this Bible actually came from a God. But just by looking at a globe, we see that he's much more effective at communicating to the United States versus less Christian nations, if this belief system were true. But instead, we see that the only way he knows how to communicate to these hidden tribes or faraway people groups is through third-party Christian missionaries. Only less than a third of the global population subscribes to Christianity. A God who understands humans would know how our need for clarity can mean life and death, yet the Bible is often ambiguous or poetic, where we really need it to be surgical and precise. How many wars and how much division has been caused by his lack of clarity, his lack of competence in effectively communicating to the people that he made? How many disagreements and how much infighting do we see between Christians? And how many splits between denominations and how many denominations in general? Many well-meaning Christians are just trying to interpret his word. And so much harm has been caused through misinterpreting. And we still don't even know who misinterpreted versus who interpreted correctly. It's all left out in the open, and we don't really know what he's saying in so many places. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. This is just one example of how vague but violent language in the Bible has led to many centuries of murder and persecution. If God truly understood humans, our tendency to interpret things literally, our fear, our hunger for control, then he would have spoken clearly. But instead, we see poetic riddles where precision is needed most. Wars, witch hunts, and endless division aren't just the fault of the readers, but the problem stems from a book that is dangerously unclear. And there's clearly no Holy Spirit interpreting this for Christians, otherwise we would see all of the Christians agreeing on a unified message. And to just blame the people for not being able to understand it properly ignores disability, trauma, and basic human limitations. A wise God would know that when words can kill, clarity is everything. Proverbs 13:24 says, "Spare the rod, spoil the child. Whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them." From just a plain reading, this verse can easily be taken either metaphorically or literally. We need more information to know what God meant. In my lifetime, I've seen it interpreted literally far more often than metaphorically. Even people who would never naturally be inclined to hit a child are letting the supposed words of God override their own opinions. This verse has been used many times to justify child abuse, to the detriment of our entire species for many, many years. It never defines what the rod is. Is it figurative or literal? Is hitting your kids a godly discipline from loving parents? Why even leave room for this interpretation of brutality? 1 Corinthians 14:34 says women should be silent in churches. They are not allowed to speak. This has been used for centuries to silence women. If God meant anything different than that, then he never did clarify himself effectively. The confusion alone has justified patriarchal dominance for generations. Things improve the further away we get from these alleged messages from God. Ephesians 6:5 says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear." This verse and others like it have been cited for centuries to defend slavery, and the Bible never outright condemns it. Any God with an understanding of human nature that believes in human rights and is able to glimpse into our future would have made this unambiguous. Slavery is evil, but he didn't. The Bible consistently reflects a worldview where female consent is not even a thing that's ever considered. The women are treated as property and marriage tokens and vessels of the male lineage, but not as full human beings with agency. God doesn't show any comprehension of female consent, thus revealing that he's as ignorant as the men who wrote him. Here are just a few examples to show how female consent is not something that God ever even considers. This is what the Lord says, "Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel." Here, the women's feelings and personal autonomy are not even considered. Their suffering is a tool to punish the men, but has no meaning in and of itself. Deuteronomy 22:28-29. "If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives." Here we see that God doesn't even question or put any provision in the law about what the woman's preference is. God just assumes that every woman just wants to marry their abuser, and the idea of asking her what she wants doesn't even come into play. And we see the payment is given to her father because the daughter is his property. If a man rapes a virgin, he must pay the father and marry her. God shows no concern for her trauma, and God doesn't even acknowledge the horror of forcing someone to live with their rapist. The option for her to refuse the marriage is not even acknowledged. Did you know that Yahweh thinks that women, when they're on their period, are unclean and need to be separated from everybody else for the full week? Yeah, he was just as confused about how the female body works as any other man back in that day. This is not what we would expect from the mind who designed women. This wasn't just about hygiene, it was about ritual purity. These women weren't even allowed to participate in worship, and they needed to separate from everybody else. How silly to make a whole production out of separating the women and not letting them do anything. And considering the Bible had only male writers, this actually turns out to be a pretty good measure of divine inspiration. Because if they're receiving information from God, then they should show understanding of the female body and the female mind. This isn't divine wisdom we're seeing. This sounds exactly like ancient tribal superstition. It's exactly what you would expect from people who don't understand anatomy, reproduction, or basic hygiene. The next revealing moment is when the God of Christianity shows us that he has no knowledge or understanding of childhood development. Deuteronomy 21:18-21 says, "If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the evil from your midst." So the God of Christianity shows a complete lack of nuance in his understanding of child behavior and development. If the God of the Bible had any understanding of the human brain, then he would understand how questioning authority And pushing your boundaries is a very healthy, natural part of child development. This is how children grow psychologically and learn to have an impact on the environment around them. But Yahweh has no understanding of this, and he calls for ending the lives of these children as soon as they behave disobediently to their parents. And that's why when the Bible gives the pseudo-wise advice that you should honor your mother and father in order to have a long life, what he means is, if you don't honor your father and mother, we're going to kill you. This law from God commands capital punishment for a rebellious or disobedient child. Not a violent criminal, not a murderer, just a kid who didn't listen to his parents. God is displaying a level of knowledge that is way below what we have now in regards to neuroscience, psychology, and just basic human experience. The truth is that disobedience is not something evil that needs to be purged. It's a normal, healthy part of growing up. This is how children explore boundaries, assert independence, and learn social norms. Rebellion, especially in adolescence, is often a very healthy stage. Childhood disobedience is important. It's involved in identity formation and cognitive growth. It's not a moral failure. We now know that many kids have neurodivergent traits that strongly impact their behaviors. It can come from autism, ADHD, or trauma responses. But stoning kids for being difficult is not justice, it's cruelty. What we see reflected in the Bible is this rigid, tribalistic culture that's just desperate for obedience. We don't see the understanding of a compassionate and all-knowing deity anywhere. A God who equates childhood rebellion with pure evil does not understand children. God must have had no idea of the technology that was going to come. Deep fake videos, Photoshop, scammers everywhere. If he had any awareness of this, he would have been careful to teach us to demand evidence before belief so that our species could thrive. Instead, we see the opposite, where God thinks it's good to encourage us to not use our minds too much and to not demand evidence. Proverbs 3:5 says, "Lean not on your own understanding." And John 20:29 says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." But in a world saturated with misinformation, scams, and manipulation, encouraging people to suppress their doubts and set aside their critical thinking is not holy, it's harmful. Judging humanity based on our willingness to believe things without evidence is an extremely poor moral standard. A real guide for humanity would definitely encourage using our thoughts, discernment, and having responsible doubt, not blind trust. Oftentimes, it's our children who suffer from our blind trust in religious authorities, but he encourages the mindset that leaves us the most exposed to it. And there are so many more examples that I could have gone with here, but I could only do so many in one video. So what does all of this mean for us? It means that we're missing that deep and accurate understanding of human nature, what we would expect from a being who designed and created us from the beginning. We don't need to be afraid to use our minds to reach clear, reasonable conclusions. But Christianity, like many religions, has embedded psychological hooks in us that make us feel guilty or fearful of thinking critically. That's why I love to break open and explore these psychological mechanisms on this channel, because once we understand how they work, then we're empowered to break free. The truth is that in the Bible, we just don't find any knowledge that wasn't available to the people at that time. So everything in the Bible could have been imagined by those men. And this gives us every reason to confidently and safely dismiss its claims of divine revelation. Well, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for being here and listening to the end. And until next time, bye-bye.